Okay, so last week, Tyler covered the first 8 or so verses of Psalm 68. I'm going to read through the whole psalm because I think it fits into a cohesive whole, and it's important to get all of it. But then we're going to talk about basically what's going on in this psalm. What's the point that David is making here? David is the author. So it says, God shall arise, his enemies shall be scattered, and those who hate him shall flee before him. As smoke is driven away, so you have driven them away. As wax melts before fire, so the wicked shall perish before God. But the righteous shall be glad. They shall exult before God. They shall be jubilant with joy. Sing to God, sing praises to his name. Lift up a song to him who rides through the deserts. His name is the Lord. Exult before him. Father of the fatherless and protector of widows is God in his holy habitation. God settles the solitary in a home. He leads out the prisoners to prosperity, but the rebellious dwell in a parched land. O God, when you went out before your people, when you marched through the wilderness, the earth quaked. The heavens poured down rain before God, the one of Sinai, before God, the God of Israel. Rain in abundance, O God, you shed abroad. You restored your inheritance as it languished. Your flock found a dwelling in it. In your goodness, O God, you provided for the needy. The Lord gives the word. The women announce the news. The women who announce the news are a great host. The kings of armies, they flee, they flee. The women at home divide the spoil, though you men lie among the sheepfolds. The wings of a dove covered with silver, its pinions with shimmering gold. When the Almighty scatters kings there, let snow fall on Zalman. O mountain of God, mountain of Bashan, O many-peaked mountain, mountain of Bashan, why do you look with hatred, O many-peaked mountain, at the mount that God desired for his abode? Yes, where the Lord will dwell forever. The chariots of God are twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands. The Lord is among them. Sinai is now in the sanctuary. You ascended on high, leading a host of captives in your train, and receiving gifts among men, even among the rebellious, that the Lord may dwell there. Blessed be the Lord who daily bears us up. God is our salvation. Our God is a God of salvation. And to God, the Lord, belong deliverances from death. But God will strike the heads of his enemies, the hairy crown of him who walks in his guilty way. The Lord said, I will bring them back from Bashan. I will bring them back from the depths of the sea, that you may strike your feet in their blood, that the tongues of your dogs may have their portion from the foe. Your procession is seen, O God, the procession of my King, of my God, my King, into the sanctuary. The singers in front, the musicians last, between them virgins playing tambourines. Bless God in the great congregation. The Lord, O you who are of Israel's fountain. There is Benjamin, the least of them, in the lead, the princes of Judah in their throng, the princes of Zebulun, the princes of Naphtali. Summon your power, O God, the power, O God, by which you have worked for us, because of your temple at Jerusalem. Kings shall bear gifts to you. Rebuke the beasts that dwell among the reeds, the herd of bulls with calves of the people. Trample underfoot those who lust after tribute. Scatter the people who delight in war. Nobles shall come from Egypt. Cush shall hasten to stretch out her hands to God. O kingdoms of the earth, sing to God, sing praises to the Lord, to him who rides in the heavens, the ancient heavens. Behold, he sends out his voice, his mighty voice. Ascribe power to God, whose majesty is over Israel. and whose power is in the skies. Awesome is God from his sanctuary, the God of Israel. He is the one who gives power and strength to his people. Blessed be God. Okay, now this psalm has a lot of kind of strange imagery talking about animals and mountains and things where we're probably like, what in the world is going on here? What is the point here? Because there's so much, it's a little bit difficult to kind of get a handle on what's going on. So the main point is that God is victorious over the enemies of Israel. And as a result of that, he's going to defeat those who are oppressing Israel and restore Israel to the peace that she desires. And of course, we can look forward to today and say, the point for us is God is victorious over the enemies of his people, whether that be Satan, whether that be political entities that are against us. Like, even though we may not see all of it right now, God is ultimately, he's conquered Satan, he's conquered death, he's conquered sin, and he's in charge over the rulers of the world. That's the big point that's here in this text. Now, to unpack that a little bit, I want to try to help maybe explain some of the metaphors and illustrations that are being used, because the psalmist makes reference, I think, especially to a lot of points of geography that we aren't familiar with. So he talks a lot about, for example, the Mount of Bashan, or the mini peak Mount of Bashan. So it's not just one mountain, it's actually a whole mountain range in Israel. And so, like, what's going on there? What's his point with this? So basically what he's doing is he's comparing Israel and this chosen city, Jerusalem, particularly Zion, which is a mountain, even though we wouldn't really see it as a mountain, it's kind of a foothill, but to them it was a mountain. Kind of like when you go into the Midwest and people talk about like hills being mountains. Like, wait, what? Anyways, but here so you've got Mount Zion, and then you've got this epic mountain range from an Israelite standard, which is the mini peak mountains of Bashan. And so you could kind of compare that to like the Olympics. The idea is it's a local mountain range that had a lot of connotations with pagan idol worship, because the idea was big mountains were a place to meet up with the gods. And so you read a lot in the Old Testament about the high places, people going up and worshiping in gardens in the high places. And you have bad kings that set up high places and good kings that destroy high places. And this is just a common theme. So part of what's going on with this whole Mount Bashan or the mini peak mount, this whole mountain range of Bashan, which, by the way, it's an actual place. So you have Israel running into King Og of Bashan as they're coming into the Promised Land. So it's just east of the Jordan River, if that helps with the geography. But really, the geography of it is irrelevant. The point is, God's chosen Israel, and specifically, he's chosen Mount Zion, Jerusalem, as his special place to tabernacle and settle. And that's why the psalmist makes such a big deal about it. So he talks about this, for example, in 15 through 18, or 15 and 16 particularly. And we'll jump back and forth to these other sections. This is part of what's going on in the argument. So, O mountain of God, mountain of Bashan, O mini peak mountain, mountain of Bashan. So in this very poetic, flowy way, David is talking about this big mountain range. Why do you look with hatred, O mini peaked mountain? So almost a better word here might be, why do you look with jealousy? So why are you feeling like you've been unjustly treated by God because God's chosen Jerusalem, this kind of puny mountain, compared to you, the epic mountain range? That's what's going on here. And of course, the mountains are a metaphor for the people. Why do you Gentile nations look with jealousy on Jerusalem? Because ultimately there will be blessing for the Gentile people. But right now, David is particularly writing as a Jew, is writing kind of he's writing an encouragement to the Israelites. And so he's he's explaining this to them. So then he brings in God's victory again in 17 and 18, which we'll get to a little bit later. But even let's go back up a little bit towards verse 8. So you have, of course, earlier on in this chapter, in this psalm, what Tyler talked about last time is a lot of God's past deeds. And so you get very deliberately, he cites in 7 through 10, the coming up from Egypt, the wilderness years, and the conquest of Joshua. And so he's past tense talking about God's provision for Israel. So this, verse 10 especially, you went out before your people, kind of leading them out of Egypt into the wilderness. When you marched through the wilderness, the earthquake, the heavens poured down rain before God, the one of Sinai. Sinai, of course, being this point back to the Ten Commandments, which are given on Sinai, this really strong moment in Israel's history. So that's all past tense stuff for David. And then even notice 11 through 14 is kind of carrying on with that same imagery or that same picture. And so when it talks about the women announcing the news, the good news of God's victory, this, for example, we could look to the story of Miriam when she's announcing God's victory as Israel has just left the Red Sea. So he's continuing to draw from Israel's history to point out God has consistently led us in victory. And so we can expect that into the future. And you'll notice then much of the rest of this psalm is saying, because of that, what's happened in the past, we can continue to expect that into the future. And that should give us hope. It should give us encouragement because we know we serve this victorious, good God who is going to protect us and defeat those who would oppress us. And so that's, in the midst of all the imagery, that's the point that David is making as he's celebrating. You get into like 12, 13, 14, which is kind of odd because it's poetic, the way that the clauses are structured is a little unusual, but this is what happens in poetry. So the women at home divide the spoil. Remember, the main point is celebrating God's victory. So the women at home divide the spoil, even though the men are still kind of out in the trenches, if you want to put it that way. The men are out fighting, but the women are dividing the spoil because the battle's been won because of God. And then second half of 13, it describes a bit of the spoil. The wings of a dove are covered with silver. So this rich booty that's been brought in from the victory in the battle. Its pinions with shimmering gold. So again, just really expressing just glory and wonder at how rich of a victory God's given them. And then verse 14, again, kind of some odd imagery. Zalman is just a close mountain, but the idea being, and this is a bit hard to translate. This verse is a little naughty, but basically the idea being, as God is sending out his enemies, as he's scattering his enemies in defeat, they're fleeing the battle. That snow is falling on Zalman and is kind of showing God's abundance. And it's a poetic way of talking about, because Israel is such a dry climate, to have snow or rain is a picture of abundance, because it's going to lead to good crop yields. It's actually really interesting. When I was in Grandview, the farmers there said snow is better than rain, because rain just falls onto the ground and is sucked down right away. Whereas snow, it's almost like having a drip faucet. And so it will continue to give the water to the soil for a longer amount of time. So it's actually better for crops. So that seems to be what's going on here. Is you've had victory, the enemies have fled, and now you have abundance and blessing that God is bringing on Israel. And this is kind of the constant themes that are being played in different ways all throughout this psalm. So then we get to the whole Mountain of Bashan thing, which we already talked about a little bit. It's kind of this same picture. So there's some change in theme here, because now God's kind of speaking to the Gentile nations. He's been talking to Israel, but now he says to the Gentile nations in this kind of picture of a mountain that's not in Israel, why are you looking with jealousy on my people? And he goes on to explain, God's got this powerful army. His chariots are twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands, which in Hebrew, basically 10,000 is the biggest number they could count to. So twice 10,000 is saying it's twice infinity. You go to the biggest number you can think of and then double it. That's the point here. It's not saying God has 2,000 troops. It's saying God has so many troops it's impossible to count them. The Lord is among them. Sinai is now in the sanctuary. And so you have this emphasis on both Sinai, which is interesting, Sinai being connected to Mount Zion. And so the connection between Moses and Israel being given the law and brought in by Moses. And then now, of course, David is the king of Jerusalem, kind of the founder. He actually conquers Jerusalem. And so you have these multiple pieces being brought in. Then verse 18, which we're going to come back to because it's quoted in Ephesians 4, talking about Christ, but you have ascended on high. So here it's talking about God. But of course, Ephesians 4 references it to Christ, which is another way in which we see how Christ is called God, because there's direct quotations from the Old Testament that aren't talking about the Messiah. They're talking, well, indirectly they are, but they're talking about God, as in the God the Israelites knew. And so Paul, even there in this quote, is making a strong claim that Jesus is the same as Yahweh, this God that's being talked about here in this verse. So we'll come back to that one towards the end. But so you ascended on high, leading a host of captives in your train and receiving gifts among men, even among the rebellious, that the Lord God may dwell there. There's a couple interesting things about this verse that I want to bring up before we look at Ephesians 4, which we'll cover the rest of the psalm before we go to Ephesians 4 at all. But again, notice the theme. There's kind of variations on a theme here, because again, it's talking about God is this victorious captain or general who's bringing his captives out. He's bringing gifts to his soldiers and to the people that he's delivered. And then the second part is, so he's receiving gifts among men, even among the rebellious, so that, and there's this purpose clause, that's the technical term for it, but like the reason that he's receiving gifts even among his enemies is so that he might dwell there, which I think has a really helpful connection with John 1 and the idea of God dwelling with, tabernacling with humans. I'm going to recap the rest of this really quickly because I want to have a little bit of time to discuss a couple questions. But blessed be the Lord who daily bears up. God is our salvation. Our God is a God of salvation. So again, notice, and there's some imagery here, but really 19 through 23 is just repeating the same kind of theme of God is victorious. He's going to destroy his enemies. He's bringing, in verse 22, he's bringing his people back almost from the mouths of these enemies that have been oppressing them. Whether you're talking about the Philistines or later on the Babylonians or others, God is delivering his people. And the people then can actually participate in the victory. And that's part of what's going on in 23. Then there's a shift in the last part of the last two sections of this psalm. So in verse 24, we see God now leading a procession of kind of his victorious army coming out of Jerusalem, or coming out of the battlefield of the enemies back into Jerusalem. And so the picture here of 25 through 20, or 24 through 27 is God kind of at the head of his people, and they're being brought in this victorious procession back into the city. And we'll come back to all of this. I just want to leave time for questions. So then in the last bit, 28 through 35, you have this hymn basically to God, particularly 32 to 35. But in 28 through 31, the request is because of what God has done for his people. Now David's saying, we need you again. So summon your power, O God, because of your temple in Jerusalem, going back to Mount Zion versus Mount Bashan theme, your temple in Jerusalem. And now you see, not only has God defeated the Gentile nations, but there's tribute that's being brought to him. And so that's what's going on in 29 through 30 through 31. You have these weird beasts. Rebuke the beast that dwells in the reeds. What's going on there? Well, the reeds is a pretty clear reference to the Nile in Egypt. So probably hippopotamus, which would have been a symbol of Egyptian power, which in David's day was really the primary power at the time. The Philistines were annoying to Israel, but they were just a local power. Egypt was the power to beat. And then Babylon and Assyria and some of these other countries come into their own after David is already dead. So after the time that this psalm has been written. But this stuff, don't worry too much about necessarily these metaphors. The metaphors are just saying these enemies that have been defeated now are going to be bringing tribute to God and tribute to God's people. And so not only have they been destroyed in battle, but they're on God's side. They've become not necessarily allies, but at least not rivals to God. And we could see, if we want to trace it into the New Testament, we could see a similar kind of thing in the future with what God's going to do with Satan and the evil powers that have tried to rise up against him in our own time and in the future. Then the last section, 32 through 35. Then I'll stop and give you guys a chance to talk. 32, so this praise to God because of what he's done and what he's going to do, which is the first 31 verses of the psalm. Now, praise God. And it really kind of comes back to the praise that God's been given at the beginning of the psalm. So praise God. Who's this God? Why should we be praising him? Verse 33, him who rides in the heavens, the ancient heavens. Behold, he sends out his voice, his mighty voice. And then talking more about God, ascribe power to God, whose majesty is over Israel, and whose power is in the skies. Awesome is God from his sanctuary, the God of Israel. He is the one who gives power and strength to his people. Blessed be God. So that's a quick overview of the content of this psalm, and hopefully to help distill some of these metaphors, make a little bit of sense of what David is trying to say in this psalm. I want to ask a few questions, and then I'll give room for questions you guys might have. I think it's really interesting at the end, you see in verse 35, it says that the God of Israel, he's the one who gives power and strength to his people. Given this psalm, or maybe a life experience or other sections of the Bible that you can think of, what are ways, what do you think David means when he says that God gives power and strength to his people?
Samuel.
What do you think it means when it says God gives power and strength to his people? It means he gives.
Speak louder.
It means he gives power and strength to his people. Nothing else.
Okay, that's fair.
That's very deep. That's like an answer I would have given when I was your age.
There's nothing else it can mean.
I think I'm sorry. Did Peter want to say something?
Go ahead, Jen.
I think that when you go through trials and things that you just don't think you can bear, that God, that's where He gives you the strength and the power and strength to go through it, to go through those really harsh times that you just aren't sure you can go through.
Yeah.
So like war, that's horrible. War's horrible.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the way that it was back then. I mean, their foes were Israel.
Yep.
Or I'm sorry, Egypt. That's who they.
And you see God, I think it's easy to spiritualize this. What's so interesting to me is in the Old Testament, often it's very practical ways that He gives power and strength to His people. He opens up the Red Sea.
I was going to say that. Yeah, He parted the water.
The wilderness,
so they
He
could
provides
cross.
all of this food and water. Right. So there's very practical, real ways that God is equipping His people to be able to go through the various trials and things that they're dealing with as on a national level. Of course, for us, it's maybe not national, but more individual. But there often are really tangible ways that God supports us when we're going through trials.
Yeah, agreed.
And David knows that this isn't what things are like in his day now. He's looking forward to what he's
looking to the future,
to what's going to happen. I mean, in verse 1, God shall arise; His enemies shall be scattered. And then He, just like us, He wasn't there at Sinai, so He has to look to the scriptures they had for comfort for, because God did this back then. We know He's going to do everything and fix everything later, and so we're so much further down the timeline than David, and we're still doing the same thing. Now we're reading what David wrote and looking back and saying,
and seeing how God supported David in his own life. And then of course we can look to Jesus and see that much further to be at risk of being a bit sacrilegious. We have that much more confirmation of God's credibility. When God says He can get the job done and defeat His enemy, if I can put this a little bluntly, you're reading Yelp reviews or Google reviews on God. God's got really good creds. He's got a lot of 5-star ratings. And so you can kind of have some confidence that God is going to actually do what He says He's going to do, even though it may take decades, like it often did for Old Testament saints. We're not left with this wimpy, iffy thing. And that's what David is saying as well. He's looking back and then he's looking forward and saying, because of all this stuff that's happened in the past, I can be confident that God is going to fulfill His promises in the future. And I find that tremendously comforting.
And even in our personal lives, we see things where God has come through, and you trust Him. And you pray, and He fulfills promises, and you see things, you just think this is never going to work, but God, I'm trusting You, and then it works, and then it's like, wow. And it's exciting, so you can look to history and what's gone in the past, but you can also see it in daily lives. So it's
the second question I want to ask as we reflect on this psalm is, so this psalm is about God's power. It's about God's victory over everything that would scare us in life. David had very tangible things to be scared of. Enemy armies repeatedly at his doorstep trying to batter down the cities and people that he was king over. And so we can look at things in our life, whether it's depression, whether it's financial crises, whether it's your car breaking down in the middle of the highway. I mean, you look around and there's big health issues, your heart failings, like real issues in your life that are concerning. Given this psalm and given the lens that David is looking through, how should our understanding of God's power and might impact how we live our lives and how we think about the trials that we're going through?
What do you think, Peter?
About the how the words and strength and power.
Yeah, well, about like how God's power that we see in the psalm, how does that impact how we should live, knowing that God is this powerful?
Looking for hope.
Should have hope. It's a very good answer.
Trust,
Mhm.
but that is easy, really easy to say, but
Easy
very
in theory,
easy. Yeah.
so hard in
Yeah.
practice.
So hard to practice. Yep, trust.
Mm.
Yeah, there's, yeah.
And it was for Bible people too.
Mhm.
I mean, you read Jeremiah or Lamentations or Job or some of the Psalms.
Oh, yeah.
And I like how raw the Bible is because it reminds you that they didn't have this wimpy view of God that's just like, oh, just believe everything will work out okay. They saw lots of things not working out okay. And they did wrestle with being like, God, where are you? I mean, Psalm 69 next week is a classic case of that.
Mhm.
And it is really hard.
Yeah, it's really hard because we see things that we view through our human eyes, and God has the full picture.
Yeah.
And so you'd think with God having the full picture of everything, it'd be easy to trust. But we want to know,
No.
we want to be aware of what
Yeah.
kind of things are going on.
That seems to be David's answer in verse 19. Blessed be the Lord who daily bears us up. God is our salvation.
Mhm.
None of these wonderful things, this procession of him leading all the tribes into Jerusalem in this victory parade, none of it's happened. But David just sort of stops and says that, blessed be the Lord who daily bears us up. God is our salvation. So he just trusts God. He's going to trust God one day at a time. And he knows because of God's faithfulness in the past that everything he's promised is going to happen. And he just takes it day by day and trusts God to bear him up. And he has bad days, like Psalm 69 and the next one, where it starts, save me, oh God. I mean, the guy has bad days, but day by day, he's just going to trust God to get through whatever is going on in his life.
Yeah. Psalm 69 is so terrifying. More in number than the hairs of my head are those who hate me without cause. That's a bad day. That's a bad, few decades.